Elizabeth Carson stood frozen as laughter erupted around her at the prestigious Hawthorne Physics Summit, where the renowned Dr. Reynolds had just publicly humiliated her for daring to question his decades-old theory. Who could have guessed that this simple high school teacher was about to shatter the foundations of modern physics and expose a fraud that had been celebrated for nearly 30 years? Perhaps we should stick to basic concepts for some attendees, Dr. Reynolds announced with a smirk, eyeing her modest dress and department store blazer. His graduate students snickered, smartphones capturing her humiliation. No one noticed her steady hands or the worn leather satchel containing 15 years of research. A small silver atom pendant slipped from beneath her blouse as she quietly returned to her seat. Some minds simply aren't built for innovation, Reynolds declared to appreciative murmurs from his academic followers. Elizabeth kept her eyes forward, ignoring the sideways glances. She'd saved for months to afford the $500 registration fee, driving 6 hours from rural Vermont in her aging Honda Civic with a heating system that worked only half the time. "Don't let them see you flinch," her father used to say. The memory of his voice steadied her as she wrote down Reynolds' dismissive words verbatim in her notebook. As the session ended, people flowed around Elizabeth like water around a stone, careful not to make eye contact with the woman who'd dare question the great Dr. Reynolds. She gathered her belongings methodically, tucking away her pen and the notebook filled with careful observations and calculations. "First time a real physics conference," came a voice beside her. Elizabeth turned to find a young woman in an expensive suit extending a business card. "I'm Jessica Warner, Dr. Reynolds' research coordinator. He wanted me to drop this off." The card read simply, "Some fields require natural aptitude. Teaching might better suit your capabilities." Jessica's smile didn't reach her eyes. Just some friendly advice from the doctor. Elizabeth slipped the card into her pocket without comment. As Jessica walked away, she failed to notice the older man who had witnessed the exchange from 3 rows back. Dr. Thomas Gardner, leaning heavily on his cane, studied Elizabeth with interest before opening his program to check her name badge against the attendee list. Later, as Elizabeth carried her lunch tray to an empty table, whispers followed her. "That's the woman who thought she could challenge Reynolds' equation," someone said loudly enough for her to hear. She ate quickly, reviewing her notes while ignoring the occasional phone camera pointed her way. By afternoon, clips of her put in her place had already appeared in private academic forums. During the final panel discussion, Elizabeth sat in the back row, jotting down observations and corrections that nobody would ever read, or so she thought. When she reached in her bag for a calculator, she found a folded note that hadn't been there before. "Your question was valid. Reynolds' equation fails at quantum boundary conditions. Meet me at Riverside Coffee after the session." Elizabeth scanned the room, wondering who had placed a note in her bag. In the front row, she spotted an elderly man with wispy white hair who turned slightly, meeting her gaze with a subtle nod before returning his attention to the panel. As the final speakers wrapped up their presentations, Elizabeth faced a choice: slink back to her budget motel room to nurse her wounded pride, or follow this mysterious lead from someone who had actually listened to her question. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. The principal of Grantham High School, where Elizabeth taught physics to uninterested teenagers, wanted to speak with her regarding a concerning video circulating online. The bell over the door jingled as Elizabeth entered Riverside Coffee. Rain pounded the windows, matching her darkening mood. The small cafe stood half empty, with only a few students typing on laptops and an elderly man sitting alone by the window. He raised his hand in greeting. As Elizabeth approached, she recognized Dr. Thomas Gardner, whose groundbreaking work she'd studied in college. His papers had mysteriously stopped 28 years ago, right when Victor Reynolds began his meteoric rise to fame. "Miss Carson," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, "I hoped you would come. You know who I am." Elizabeth set down her satchel, still damp from the rain. A high school physics teacher from Vermont who just asked the most important question about gravitational wave theory in 27 years. Gardner pushed a steaming mug toward her. "I ordered you a coffee. Hope you don't mind. Black, like a serious physicist drinks." Elizabeth wrapped her cold fingers around the warm mug. "You left that note." Reynolds won't admit it, but his equation falls apart at the quantum level. "You spotted the flaw that the so-called experts have ignored for decades." Gardner leaned forward. I've been watching the field destroy itself with celebrity worship and institutional arrogance. Real science doesn't care what clothes you wear or where you work. Elizabeth studied the man carefully. Why are you talking to me? I'm nobody in this field. Because I recognize the look of someone who solves physics problems at night instead of sleeping. Gardner tapped her satchel. What's in there isn't just notes, is it? Elizabeth hesitated before pulling out a worn notebook filled with equations and diagrams. I've been working on an alternative approach to gravitational waves since graduate school. Gardner flipped through the pages, his eyebrows rising higher with each turn. Good God, he whispered. You've nearly solved it. It doesn't matter. No journal would accept a submission from a high school teacher without university affiliation. Gardner closed the notebook. What if you had help? I've been retired for years, but my name still carries weight. Elizabeth's phone buzzed again. A text from Principal Fisher. Board meeting tomorrow regarding your professional conduct. Attendance mandatory. She showed Gardner the message. Seems Reynolds' followers work quickly. They're scared, Gardner said, a small smile forming. The Emperor's clothes are starting to look threadbare. Elizabeth's landlord texted next. Saw you on YouTube getting schooled by real scientists. Maybe stick to teaching kids. Rent increase starts next month, by the way. I can't fight this, Elizabeth said, sliding her notebook back into her bag. I have a job, bills, students who depend on me. Your father was Robert Carson from MIT, wasn't he? I recognized the pendant. Gardner nodded toward the silver atom hanging from her neck. He was brilliant, too. Never play the politics. Elizabeth touched the pendant reflexively. You knew him. We collaborated briefly before your father left academia to teach. He said he could make a bigger difference with younger minds. Gardner's eyes softened. He would be proud of the question you asked today. Elizabeth blinked back, unexpected tears. He died believing his work was forgotten. Science remembers, even when scientists pretend not to. Gardner pulled a business card from his pocket. I have 6 months left, according to my oncologist. Not enough time to finish what I started, but perhaps enough to help someone else break through. Elizabeth stared at the card. What are you suggesting? A partnership. My institutional credibility with your breakthrough work. Gardner's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. Reynolds is keynoting the International Physics Symposium next month. They're accepting late submissions until Friday. You want me to present my unfinished theory at the biggest physics event of the year? Elizabeth laughed without humor. They'd laugh me out of the building. Only if they recognize you. Gardner pointed to a television mounted in the corner, where a news clip showed Elizabeth's confrontation with Reynolds. The caption read, Local teacher schooled by physics legend. They've already decided who you are, Gardner said. The question is, are you ready to show them who you really are? Elizabeth's phone lit up with a final message from Victor Reynolds himself. Persistence in error is not a virtue in science. Stay in your lane, Miss Carson. She looked up at Gardner, something hardening in her expression. What if we did more than submit a paper? What if we proved Reynolds has been wrong for 27 years? You're suspended without pay, effective immediately. Principal Fisher slid the printed emails across his desk. Complaints from parents, screenshots of social media posts, and a formal letter from the Hawthorne Institute demanding Elizabeth cease misrepresenting herself as a physics authority. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her father's pendant. Robert, these parents haven't even seen the video. They're reacting to rumors. It doesn't matter what's true anymore. Fisher removed his glasses, suddenly looking older. The school board received calls from 3 university donors, threatening to withdraw STEM funding from our district. They're claiming you embarrassed the entire education community. Beyond the office window, Elizabeth could see her students filing into the school. Jason with his always untied shoelaces. Maria, who stayed after class to ask about black holes. Trent, who pretended not to care, but had the highest test scores. How long? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. 2 weeks minimum. They're meeting next Friday to discuss. Fisher couldn't finish. Elizabeth completed his thought. To discuss termination. She drove home in silence, windshield wipers beating a rhythm that matched her racing thoughts. The rain hadn't stopped since yesterday. When she reached her apartment above the laundromat, she found a notice taped to her door. Rent increase. 30% effective next month. Inside, she moved automatically to the whiteboard wall, where equations stretched from floor to ceiling. The building's old heating system clanked and wheezed, barely warming the small space. Her phone rang. "Dr. Gardner, they came after your job, didn't they?" he asked without preamble. "How did you know?" "Because I got a call from the University Pension Board this morning threatening to review my benefits if I continue associating with you." His laugh held no humor. Reynolds works quickly. Elizabeth sank on her worn couch. "Maybe I should just apologize. I have students who need me. And what lesson would that teach them? That truth bends to power? That questions shouldn't be asked if they make important people uncomfortable." Gardner's voice strengthened. "Check your email. I've sent you something." Elizabeth opened her laptop to find a video attachment. The footage showed a much younger Thomas Gardner in a lab with another man, Victor Reynolds, 30 years earlier. They were celebrating, champagne glasses raised toward what appeared to be the first version of the famous Reynolds equation on a chalkboard. "I don't understand," Elizabeth said. "Keep watching." The video continued as young Gardner collapsed suddenly, clutching his chest. Reynolds helped him to a chair before the video ended. "Heart attack. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital," Gardner explained. "When I recovered, Reynolds had published our joint work under only his name. I had no proof of my contributions because our lab notes mysteriously disappeared during my hospitalization." Elizabeth stared at the screen. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because history is about to repeat itself unless we act." Gardner's breathing sounded labored. "Reynolds has submitted a new paper incorporating elements of your theory without citation." Elizabeth's head snapped up. "How could he know my work? The question you asked revealed your understanding. He's racing to patch the holes in his theory before someone else, you, can publish the correction." Gardner paused. "We have 3 days before his paper appears in the Physics Review. After that, your work becomes derivative of his." Elizabeth stood, pacing before her equation wall. "But we're not ready. The symposium isn't for weeks. Reynolds is presenting a preview of his breakthrough at Westfield University tomorrow night." Gardner's voice grew urgent. "It's time to choose, Elizabeth. Fade away or fight for your place in history." She touched her father's pendant, remembering his words. "In physics and in life, the observer affects the outcome just by showing up." Elizabeth turned to her wall of equations. "Tell me what we need to do." Cameras flashed as Victor Reynolds strode into Westfield University's Maxwell Auditorium. Faculty members jostled for handshakes while graduate students hovered at respectful distances, hoping to be noticed. Through this sea of academic worship, Elizabeth slipped undetected, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing glasses she normally kept for reading. "Are you sure he won't recognize you?" Thomas Gardner whispered from beside her, leaning heavily on his cane. "Reynolds sees what he expects to see," Elizabeth replied, helping Gardner to a seat in the middle of the auditorium. "And he doesn't expect to see me here." The crowd quieted as Reynolds took the stage, his expensive suit and confident smile projecting the image of scientific royalty. "Tonight," he began, "I'll preview a refinement to gravitational wave theory that resolves certain inconsistencies raised recently." Elizabeth tensed. He was already trying to incorporate her critique without acknowledgement. "But first," Reynolds continued, sliding into a familiar tone, "a cautionary tale about scientific integrity." The screen behind him flashed to an image of Elizabeth at the summit, her face frozen in surprise at his mockery. "This is what happens when amateurs play at being physicists." Laughter rippled through the audience. Elizabeth's fingers curled into her palms, but her expression remained neutral. Gardner placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Let him finish the performance." For 40 minutes, Reynolds presented what he called a revolutionary update to his famous equation. Elizabeth recognized fragments of her work embedded within his mathematical sleight of hand, disguised by unnecessarily complex notation and reworded explanations. "He's stealing my approach to quantum boundary conditions," she whispered to Gardner. "But making critical errors in the process," Gardner replied. "He doesn't truly understand the mechanism you discovered." When Reynolds invited questions, Elizabeth stood. The blood rushing in her ears nearly drowned out her own voice. "Dr. Reynolds, your modified equation still produces a 13% variance when applied to binary neutron star systems." Reynolds squinted, trying to place her. "And your name is?" "Dr. Elizabeth Carson." She removed her glasses. We met at the Hawthorne Summit. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a flash of panic quickly masked by condescension. "Ah, Miss Carson, I see you've given yourself a promotion to doctor." Murmurs spread through the audience. The high school teacher had crashed their prestigious event. "I completed my doctorate at MIT 12 years ago," Elizabeth replied evenly, moving toward the stage. "My dissertation on quantum gravitational effects was supervised by Dr. Marcus Whitfield." Reynolds' smile hardened. Whitfield is a theoretical purist with no practical applications to his name. Elizabeth continued walking, her voice carrying clearly. "I've brought copies of my complete solution to the boundary problem you're attempting to address." She withdrew papers from her bag, including the correction to your original equation. Reynolds motioned to security. "This is inappropriate. Please remove her." "Actually," came a firm voice from the back, "I believe we should hear this." Dr. Patricia Moore, Westfield's physics department chair, stood. "Academic discourse requires we evaluate evidence, not credentials." The security guard hesitated as Elizabeth reached the stage steps. Reynolds moved to block her. "This is my presentation, and this is my theory you're trying to claim as your refinement." Elizabeth held up her paper. "Page 6 shows where your equation breaks down at the quantum level. Page 12 provides the corrected formula." Dr. Moore approached, hand extended for the papers. "Let me see those, please." As she reviewed Elizabeth's work, the room fell silent. Moore's eyebrows rose progressively higher. "This is extraordinarily elegant." She looked up at Reynolds. "Victor, did you review these calculations before developing your refinement?" Reynolds' face flushed. "I've never seen those papers. She's clearly plagiarized my work and is trying to claim priority." Elizabeth remained calm. "My submissions to 3 journals over the past 5 years were all rejected without review. I can provide the dated rejection letters." Gardner stood shakily. "And I can testify that Elizabeth shared these equations with me months ago, long before tonight's presentation." Reynolds' eyes widened as he recognized his former partner. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" "Watching history repeat itself," Gardner replied. "Except this time, there's proof." Dr. Moore flipped to the final page of Elizabeth's paper, where the full implications became clear. "This doesn't just refine Reynolds' equation," she announced to the room. "It fundamentally replaces it with a more comprehensive model." The physics world shifted on its axis as Reynolds lunged for the papers. "This is absurd. I built my career on this work." "Yes," Elizabeth said quietly. "But not all of it was yours to begin with, was it?" Cameras flashed like lightning as Elizabeth exited Westfield University's science building. Overnight, her confrontation with Reynolds had exploded across academic networks and science news sites. "Unknown teacher challenges physics giant," read one headline. "Reynolds' equation under fire," proclaimed another. "Dr. Carson, is it true Reynolds stole your work?" shouted a reporter from Scientific American. Elizabeth clutched her satchel closer. No comment at this time. She slipped into the waiting taxi where Thomas Gardner already sat, looking exhausted but pleased. "You've stirred the hornet's nest," he said as the car pulled away. Her phone buzzed constantly. Emails from journals suddenly interested in her research. Messages from former colleagues who'd long forgotten her name. Interview requests from podcasts and science shows. "It's too much," she murmured, turning off her phone. "I never wanted fame, just recognition for the work." "Fame finds those who don't seek it," Gardner replied. "Reynolds has called an emergency press conference at the Hawthorne Institute for this afternoon." The taxi radio crackled with a news update. Prestigious Hawthorne Institute stands firmly behind Dr. Reynolds, questioning the credentials and motives of his accuser. Elizabeth leaned her head against the window. "They're closing ranks around him." "Of course they are. Reynolds brings in millions in grant money." Gardner's face, reflected in the glass, looked ghostly pale. "But Dr. Moore from Westfield has already contacted 4 independent physicists to review your equations." The taxi stopped at a small cafe where they could regroup. Over steaming mugs of tea, Elizabeth opened her laptop to find an email from Principal Fisher. "Board meeting canceled. Please call me immediately." Before she could react, another message appeared from Dr. Jessica Warner, Reynolds' research coordinator. "We need to talk privately. I have something you should see." "It could be a trap," Gardner warned. Elizabeth checked the time. "Reynolds' press conference is in 3 hours." What could Jessica possibly offer now? Her phone rang. Principal Fisher. She answered hesitantly. Elizabeth, have you seen the news? Fisher's voice sounded different, almost reverential. Some of it. The school board chairman received calls from NASA and Princeton University asking about you. Suddenly everyone's very interested in our distinguished faculty member. Fisher cleared his throat. Your suspension has been lifted. In fact, they're discussing a promotion to advanced placement director. Elizabeth almost laughed at the absurdity. Robert, yesterday they were ready to fire me. Yesterday you were just a teacher who embarrassed the district. Today you're a scientific whistleblower challenging academic corruption. Fisher's tone grew serious. The world changed overnight, Elizabeth. After hanging up, Elizabeth stared at Jessica's email. I need to know what she has. I'll come with you, Gardner insisted, though his hands shook as he lifted his tea. No, Elizabeth said firmly. Your color is terrible. You need rest. She helped him into another taxi, headed to his hotel. I'll meet you before the press conference. Elizabeth waited alone at the cafe, her father's pendant cool against her skin. When Jessica Warner finally appeared, her designer suit was wrinkled, her eyes red-rimmed. You've ruined everything, Jessica said, sliding into the seat across from Elizabeth. I only revealed the truth. The truth. Jessica laughed bitterly. Do you know what Reynolds did when he got back to the hotel last night? He destroyed research data. Decades of it. Said it was compromised now. Elizabeth felt a chill. What kind of data? Jessica placed a thumb drive on the table. Everything. Original notes. Test results. Including files labeled Gardner Reynolds' initial formulations. Why are you giving me this? Jessica's perfect facade cracked. Because I spent 7 years working for a man who takes credit for others' brilliance. Including mine. She stood to leave. Reynolds is planning something at the press conference. I don't know what, but he said he'd end this circus once and for all. As Jessica walked away, Elizabeth examined the thumb drive that might contain the final proof of Reynolds' decades-long deception. But what was he planning that made even his loyal assistant turn against him? The Hawthorne Institute's marble steps were crowded with reporters and academics as Elizabeth approached. Security guards blocked her path until Dr. Patricia Moore from Westfield appeared at her side. She's with me, Moore stated firmly. As a subject matter expert. Inside the packed auditorium, Elizabeth spotted Thomas Gardner already seated near the front, looking frail but determined. Their eyes met briefly before the lights dimmed. Victor Reynolds strode onto the stage looking immaculate in a fresh suit, his composure fully restored. Behind him stood the Institute's board of directors, their faces solemn. Thank you all for coming, Reynolds began, his voice steady. Science advances through both discovery and correction. Today, I must make a difficult but necessary correction. Elizabeth tensed as cameras turned toward her. I've reviewed Dr. Carson's equations thoroughly, Reynolds continued, and found substantial merit in her approach to quantum boundary conditions. Murmurs spread through the audience. Therefore, I'm announcing my full support for the Carson-Reynolds adjustment to gravitational wave theory. He smiled magnanimously. I've invited Dr. Carson to co-author a paper with me, combining our work for the benefit of science. The crowd erupted in applause at this apparent gesture of academic generosity. Reynolds was attempting to salvage his reputation by absorbing her work rather than fighting it, still claiming partial credit while appearing humble. Elizabeth felt her father's pendant grow heavy around her neck. This wasn't justice. It was another theft in progress. Dr. Carson, Reynolds called out, would you care to join me on stage to discuss our collaboration? All eyes turned toward her. This was Reynolds' trap. Refuse publicly and appear petty, or accept and validate his claim to her work. Elizabeth walked slowly toward the stage, each step measured. Gardner watched anxiously as she took position at the podium. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds, she began quietly. But I must decline your generous offer. Reynolds' smile froze. Perhaps you misunderstand the opportunity. I understand perfectly. Elizabeth connected her laptop to the projector. Before discussing collaborations, I believe transparency is essential. The screen behind them filled with a document dated 30 years earlier. The original Gardner-Reynolds research notes from the thumb drive Jessica had provided. These files were deleted from the Institute's servers last night, Elizabeth explained. Fortunately, Dr. Warner preserved copies. Reynolds stepped forward. Those are confidential. They show that the foundation of your equation was developed jointly with Dr. Thomas Gardner. Elizabeth highlighted a crucial section. His signature appears on every page of the original formulation. The audience stirred as Elizabeth displayed more documents. Rejection letters from journals dating back years, her complete theory with timestamps, and finally, an email from Reynolds to the Institute board. Need to discredit Carson immediately. Propose emergency investigation into her background. Reynolds lunged for the laptop. This is a violation of privacy. Dr. Moore stepped forward. Actually, as scientific research conducted with public funding, all of this falls under transparency requirements. From his seat, Gardner slowly stood. The Reynolds equation was always our equation, Victor. Elizabeth didn't just find an adjustment. She completed what we started 30 years ago. The audience watched in stunned silence as the full picture emerged. Not just academic bullying, but decades of systematic credit theft. Reynolds' face contorted with rage. You were nothing without me, Thomas. A hospital bound has been while I built our work into a cornerstone of modern physics. His outburst confirmed everything. The Carson-Gardner equation, Elizabeth corrected softly. And it's not an adjustment, but a complete reformulation that finally integrates quantum effects with gravitational wave propagation. Dr. Moore nodded to colleagues in the audience who were already reviewing the equations. One by one, they stood in silent validation of her work. Reynolds looked around wildly as his support crumbled. This is absurd. She's a high school teacher. She doesn't even have a proper lab. Science doesn't care about titles or facilities. Elizabeth replied calmly. Only truth matters. 3 months later, Elizabeth stood at the podium of the International Physics Symposium. Behind her sat Thomas Gardner in a wheelchair, finally receiving long overdue recognition as co-creator of foundational gravitational theory. The universe reveals its secrets to those who listen, Elizabeth began, regardless of their credentials or appearance. As she presented their now verified equation, Elizabeth touched her father's silver atom pendant, now paired with a matching one given to her by Gardner. In the back row sat a young woman in worn shoes and a hand-mended blazer, taking careful notes with bright, attentive eyes. Elizabeth smiled directly at her. Remember, she concluded, in physics as in life, the simplest solution is often the most profound and the most overlooked.